Before you can ever hope to free yourself from the grasp of toxic people, you must first learn to recognize them for what they are. This is not as simple as it sounds. Toxicity doesn't always parade itself in neon lights or thunderous outbursts. Often it cloaks itself in subtle behaviors, in the small erosions of your confidence and peace of mind. Toxic people don't just show up one day and declare their ill intent. They weave their influence into your life quietly, gradually, like a slow poison, until one day you realize you've been suffering in their presence for far too long. The first step in reclaiming your life is developing a kind of psychological radar, an acute awareness of what toxic behavior really looks like beneath the surface. When you understand the mechanics of toxicity, you no longer remain blind to its presence. You see it clearly, like a dark stain on otherwise bright fabric. Toxicity often manifests through manipulation. It's a controlling strategy wrapped in charm, guilt, or false kindness. The manipulator's aim is to bend your will to theirs, subtly undermining your autonomy while making you believe you're the one who chose to comply. It might sound like, "I'm only doing this for your own good," or "if you cared about me, you'd die." These phrases aren't just innocent words, they're tools designed to chip away at your sense of self. Recognizing these tactics is crucial because manipulation doesn't always look like aggression. Sometimes it's a quiet pressure that feels like a favor or a request that you're expected to accept without question. Another hallmark is relentless negativity. Toxic people often view the world through a lens clouded by bitterness, resentment, or self-pity. When you're around them, their mood is contagious but destructive. They drain energy from every conversation, turning joy into doubt, enthusiasm into hesitation. This is not just about being pessimistic, it's a persistent, corrosive attitude that infects those nearby with cynicism and despair. Over time, this negativity is not just unpleasant. It's harmful. It seeps into your thoughts and emotions, leaving you less capable of joy, more prone to anxiety. Disrespect is another telltale sign. But this isn't always the obvious insult or harsh word. Toxic disrespect often hides in dismissal, belittling, or undermining your achievements and feelings. It's the eye roll when you share an idea, the cutting remark disguised as humor, the subtle put-downs that chip away at your confidence. This form of toxicity teaches you to doubt yourself, making you question your worth and validity. Understanding the philosophical core of why recognizing toxicity is vital requires us to look at how human beings relate to their social environments. We are fundamentally social creatures, wired to seek connection, approval, and belonging. However, this wiring also makes us vulnerable. Toxic individuals exploit our natural desire for acceptance, twisting relationships into chains rather than sources of support. The challenge, then, is to reclaim your sovereignty, your right to choose what influences you allow into your mental and emotional space. Psychologically, this means cultivating what's called emotional intelligence, particularly the facet of self-awareness. The more you understand your own feelings and reactions, the easier it becomes to spot when someone else's behavior is intentionally or unintentionally causing harm. Toxic people thrive on confusion and emotional entanglement, so clarity is your most effective defense. When you know yourself well, you recognize when your peace is disturbed not by external circumstances, but by the toxic dynamics at play. This awareness also invites a necessary shift in perspective, seeing toxic behavior not as a personal failure on your part, but as a reflection of the other person's unresolved issues. Toxic people are often deeply insecure, wounded, or struggling with their own shadows. This understanding doesn't excuse their behavior, but it allows you to detach emotionally from their toxicity. You begin to understand that their actions are about their own internal chaos, not a judgment of your worth. Yet recognition alone isn't enough. It must be coupled with resolve, the commitment to protect yourself once you identify these patterns. Without this, awareness becomes passive observation, which leaves you vulnerable. But armed with insight, you gain power. You shift from victimhood into agency. So, as you move forward in this journey, start paying close attention to your interactions. Notice how you feel after spending time with certain people. Are you uplifted or drained? Empowered or diminished? Confident or doubting yourself? Trust these emotional signals. They are your mind's way of flagging toxicity. The moment you identify these signs, you've taken the first critical step in ensuring that toxic people will never bother you again. Because ultimately, freedom from toxicity begins with clarity, seeing the darkness clearly so you can walk out of the shadow. And once you do that, nothing or no one has the power to dim your light again. Once you've learned to recognize toxicity, the next crucial step is to set clear and firm boundaries. This is where the theoretical transforms into the practical. Awareness alone isn't enough to shield you. You must take deliberate action to protect your emotional and mental space. Boundaries are not just rules you impose on others, they are declarations of your own self-respect and sovereignty. Consider boundaries as invisible fences around your well-being, lines drawn in the sand that say, "This is where I end, and you begin." They are the expression of your right to be treated with dignity and kindness, and they serve as a protective barrier against those who would drain or diminish you. Without boundaries, you are effectively an open field, vulnerable to the encroachment of toxic forces. Philosophically, setting boundaries is an act of autonomy. It is a refusal to surrender your agency to the whims or demands of others, especially those who do not have your best interests at heart. It acknowledges that your time, energy, and emotional resources are finite and precious, not commodities to be exploited. In a world that often pressures us to please, to comply, and to endure discomfort for the sake of peace, boundaries reclaim the radical notion that peace begins within, and it is non-negotiable. Psychologically, boundaries serve several key functions. They teach others how to treat you. Without them, people can assume unlimited access to your time and emotional energy. Boundaries provide clarity, preventing the ambiguity that toxic individuals often exploit to manipulate or control. For example, if you allow someone to interrupt you repeatedly during a conversation, you signal that your voice is less important. A boundary here might mean calmly but firmly saying, "Please let me finish." This simple assertion resets the dynamic and demands respect. But setting boundaries isn't only about what you say to others, it also involves internal discipline. It requires you to identify what you will and will not tolerate, not just from toxic people, but from anyone who interacts with your life. This takes deep self-knowledge and honesty. What behaviors erode your self-worth? What actions leave you feeling depleted or disrespected? When you answer these questions clearly, you can draw your lines with precision. One common mistake is to confuse boundaries with walls. Walls isolate, boundaries protect while allowing healthy connection. Boundaries are flexible in the right places and firm in the essential ones. They invite respect and mutual understanding, creating safer spaces for relationships that uplift rather than harm. Now, the process of setting boundaries can be uncomfortable at first, especially if you've spent years accommodating others' toxicity out of fear, guilt, or a misguided sense of duty. It often triggers resistance from the toxic person and sometimes from within yourself. They may react with anger, guilt tripping, or attempts to undermine your resolve. This is a test, not a failure. It reveals who truly respects you and who is willing to honor your limits. Think of this boundary setting as a negotiation with reality. You're not demanding perfection or control over others, but you are demanding respect for your humanity. It's a statement that your well-being matters as much as theirs. This approach shifts the power dynamic. Instead of being a passive recipient of toxicity, you become an active participant in shaping the quality of your relationships. To make boundaries effective, communication is key. Be clear, direct, and calm. Avoid over-explaining or justifying yourself endlessly. That only opens the door to debate. For instance, if a friend constantly belittles your achievements, you might say, "I value support in my friendships. When you dismiss my efforts, it hurts. I need you to respect my accomplishments." Simple, firm, and focused on your feelings rather than accusations. This approach disarms defensiveness and centers the conversation on mutual respect. Importantly, boundaries are a continuous process, not a one-time event. They require ongoing attention and adjustment as relationships evolve. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, a toxic person refuses to respect your limits. In those cases, boundaries serve as a clear signal that further action, such as limiting contact or walking away, is necessary. But without boundaries in place first, this next step becomes far more difficult. The beauty of setting boundaries is that they empower you to reclaim control. They restore balance and bring a sense of safety to your interactions. When you enforce your boundaries, you send a message to yourself and the world that you are worthy of respect and care. This confidence often has a ripple effect, attracting healthier relationships and repelling toxicity. Reflect on this: boundaries are a profound expression of self-love. They are not selfish or punitive, but necessary. They are the foundation upon which a life free from toxic intrusion is built. When you draw your line firmly and consistently, you say to toxic people, and perhaps to your own inner doubts, that your peace is not negotiable. So, as you think about the toxic influences you may still tolerate, ask yourself, where are my boundaries weak or unclear? What lines have I been afraid to draw? Remember, every boundary you set is an act of liberation, a declaration that you will no longer be diminished or disrespected. The moment you commit to this principle, you initiate a transformation. Toxic people will test your boundaries, but they will never bother you again in the same way once they realize you will not let them cross your line. Now that you've recognized toxicity and set your boundaries, the next step is perhaps the most subtle and the most powerful: practicing emotional detachment. This is not about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about cultivating an internal resilience that allows you to observe toxic behavior without being consumed by it. Emotional detachment is a profound skill rooted in both psychology and philosophy, and mastering it is essential for protecting your peace and sanity. To understand why emotional detachment matters, consider how toxic people operate. Their influence depends largely on your emotional reactions. They provoke, manipulate, and undermine precisely because these reactions create openings, cracks in your mental armor. The more emotionally entangled you become, the more power they wield. It's like giving a match to someone who wants to burn down your house. Your reaction fuels the fire. Detachment, then, is about refusing to hand over that match. This isn't about suppressing your feelings or pretending to be unaffected. That would be neither healthy nor authentic. Instead, it's about cultivating a stance of mindful awareness, seeing toxic behaviors for what they are without internalizing their impact. It's the difference between feeling anger, sadness, or frustration and letting those feelings dictate your sense of self or your actions. Emotional detachment allows you to acknowledge your feelings without letting them control you. Philosophically, this practice finds its roots in Stoicism and Buddhist thought, both of which emphasize the distinction between what is within your control and what is not. Toxic people's actions are outside your control, your emotional response is within it. When you detach emotionally, you reclaim responsibility for your inner state. You recognize that you can choose how to engage or not engage with toxicity. Psychologically, emotional detachment enhances your resilience by strengthening your emotional boundaries. It prevents toxic interactions from triggering a cascade of negative thoughts and feelings that can spiral into anxiety, depression, or self-doubt. Instead of absorbing toxicity, you learn to observe it as a phenomenon separate from your own identity and well-being. This separation is key because toxic behavior, at its core, is a reflection of the other person's issues, not a commentary on your value or worth. Achieving this kind of detachment requires practice. It begins with self-awareness, recognizing when your emotions are being hijacked. Often, toxic people will push buttons you didn't even realize you had, stirring up deep-seated insecurities or fears. The first step is to pause and notice the physical and emotional signs of this hijacking. A tightening in your chest, a racing heart, or sudden irritation. This moment of awareness creates a gap, a space where you can choose your response rather than react impulsively. In that space, you can employ techniques to detach, mentally stepping back from the situation, reframing the toxic behavior as a symptom of someone else's pain or dysfunction, or reminding yourself that their words and actions say more about them than about you. This cognitive shift transforms your perspective from victimhood to observer. You acknowledge what is happening without letting it erode your inner peace. Another important element is cultivating compassion, not for the sake of excusing toxic behavior, but to prevent it from triggering personal offense. When you understand that toxic people often act out of unresolved trauma, fear, or insecurity, you can maintain empathy without tolerance. Compassion becomes a tool of emotional detachment. It helps you maintain your calm and dignity without condoning harmful actions. Of course, this doesn't mean accepting ongoing abuse or ignoring your boundaries. Emotional detachment complements boundary setting by making your responses less reactive and more deliberate. When you aren't emotionally entangled, enforcing your boundaries becomes less emotionally draining and more effective. You won't feel compelled to argue, plead, or seek approval from someone who consistently disrespects you. This detachment also guards against what I call the emotional residue toxic people leave behind, the lingering feelings of anger, hurt, or confusion that can haunt you long after an interaction ends. By detaching emotionally in the moment, you reduce the chance that this residue accumulates and weighs you down over time. The paradox of emotional detachment is that it leads not to isolation or coldness, but to greater emotional freedom. You become less reactive, more centered, and more capable of responding from a place of strength rather than vulnerability. This freedom transforms your relationships and interactions because it signals that you are no longer a source of fuel for toxicity. Reflect on this. Toxic people rely on emotional engagement to maintain their control. When you master emotional detachment, you essentially remove their power over you. You become an unshakable presence, calm, clear, and unbothered. The challenge, of course, is that detachment requires courage and discipline. It's easier said than done, especially when toxicity strikes at your deepest wounds. But every time you practice stepping back, every time you choose observation over reaction, you build a muscle of resilience that strengthens with use. So ask yourself, in what moments have I given my emotional power away? Where could I step back and observe rather than engage? Remember, emotional detachment is not about shutting down, it's about opening a space where your peace remains inviolable. Once you've recognized toxic behavior, set your boundaries, and practiced emotional detachment, the next essential step is to limit, or when necessary, cut off contact with toxic individuals. This step is where theory meets action in the clearest way. It's the point at which you physically and mentally reclaim your space, making the commitment that toxicity will no longer be a fixture in your life. Limiting contact is not a simple decision, nor is it one to be taken lightly. It carries weight because it involves saying no, not just to harmful behavior, but often to people who might have been close to us, family members, old friends, colleagues. This can stir feelings of guilt, obligation, or fear of loneliness. These emotions are natural but must be understood and managed, not allowed to keep you tethered to relationships that undermine your well-being. Philosophically, this act is about prioritizing your own flourishing over the demands of unhealthy attachment. It is a declaration that your mental and emotional health deserves respect and protection above social convenience or outdated loyalties. In a sense, limiting contact is a form of radical self-respect. It recognizes that not all relationships are meant to last forever, and that it's perfectly valid, even necessary, to step away from those that stunt your growth or corrode your peace. Psychologically, repeated exposure to toxic individuals can activate chronic stress responses. Our brains, wired for social connection, still respond to negative interactions as threats. This triggers fight, flight, or freeze responses, releasing hormones like cortisol that over time damage our health and resilience. Limiting contact disrupts this cycle, giving your nervous system a chance to recalibrate and heal. But limiting contact doesn't always mean a total severance. Sometimes it involves managing the frequency, setting clear boundaries about topics, or choosing safer contexts for interaction. For example, you might reduce meetings to group settings rather than one-on-one, or keep conversations focused on neutral, practical matters. This approach preserves necessary connections without sacrificing your well-being. However, there are situations where cutting off contact altogether is the healthiest choice. When toxic behaviors escalate to abuse, emotional, verbal, or otherwise, detachment and boundaries reach their limits. At this point, total disconnection is a necessary act of survival. This might mean blocking phone numbers, unfriending on social media, or even legal measures in extreme cases. It's important to acknowledge the emotional difficulty here. Letting go can feel like loss, triggering grief, even when the relationship was harmful. This grief is real and valid because it marks the end of a significant chapter in your life. Yet, this loss is not a defeat, but a liberation, a clearing of space for healthier connections and inner peace. Setting limits or cutting contact also challenges cultural and social narratives that equate loyalty with unconditional tolerance. We are often taught that family must be accepted as they are, or that friendships should be maintained despite damage. But this mindset ignores the fundamental truth that relationships thrive on mutual respect and support. When toxicity dominates, what remains is not relationship but harm. Limiting contact is a proactive choice that reclaims your narrative. It's about taking control of who influences your emotional landscape. By choosing carefully whom you engage with, you cultivate an environment where positivity and growth can flourish. You become the gatekeeper of your life's quality. Practically, this step requires courage and clarity. It's not about burning bridges recklessly, but about making intentional decisions aligned with your well-being. Sometimes explaining your boundaries clearly can help, but remember, you are not obligated to justify your choices endlessly. Your peace is reason enough. The process also invites self-compassion. It's easy to blame yourself for letting toxic people linger too long. Instead, recognize that breaking free is a journey, and every step forward is progress. Celebrate the courage it takes to walk away from what no longer serves you. Think of limiting or cutting contact as pruning a tree. By removing the dead or diseased branches, you allow the healthy parts to grow stronger and bear fruit. It's an act of care and vision, a commitment to a healthier future. Reflect on this: you cannot control others, but you can control your exposure. When you limit contact with toxicity, you create the space to heal, to thrive, and to invite positive energy into your life. So ask yourself, where in your life is toxicity still allowed entry? What relationships demand too much of your peace? And what steps will you take today to close those doors? Remember, the power to protect your well-being is in your hands. Limiting contact is not just a strategy, it's a profound act of self-love and liberation. When you make this choice decisively, toxic people will no longer bother you, not because they have changed, but because you have changed your relationship to them. Your life deserves this freedom. Claim it. After recognizing toxicity, setting boundaries, practicing emotional detachment, and limiting contact, the final and perhaps most enriching step is to focus on self-care and cultivate positive relationships. This is the part where transformation moves beyond defense and becomes an active pursuit of well-being and growth. It's a commitment not only to protect your peace, but to build a life so nourishing and vibrant that toxicity simply cannot find a foothold. Self-care, at its core, is often misunderstood as indulgence or mere relaxation. But true self-care runs deeper. It is a profound acknowledgement that you are worthy of care, respect, and intentional nurturing. Philosophically, it's an act of honoring your intrinsic value as a human being. When you prioritize your well-being, you send a message, first to yourself, then to the world, that your life matters and that you deserve environments that support your flourishing. Psychologically, investing in self-care rewires your brain's stress response. Chronic exposure to toxicity leaves us in a state of hypervigilance, where anxiety and negativity become the default. Practices like mindfulness, adequate rest, healthy nutrition, and meaningful activities counterbalance this state by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, your body's rest and repair mode. Over time, these habits build resilience, enhancing your ability to maintain calm and clarity even in challenging situations. Equally important is the deliberate cultivation of positive relationships. This isn't about surrounding yourself with people who simply agree with you or avoid conflict, but about fostering connections that are reciprocal, respectful, and rooted in genuine care. Positive relationships act as a counterweight to toxicity. They provide emotional nourishment, encouragement, and a mirror that reflects your worth back to you. From a philosophical perspective, this pursuit aligns with Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, human flourishing achieved through meaningful relationships and virtuous living. We are social beings, and our highest potential is realized not in isolation but in connection with others who uplift us and challenge us to grow. Choosing to nurture these relationships is an active choice to create a life of purpose and joy. Psychologically, healthy relationships contribute to our sense of belonging and self-esteem. They provide a safe space for vulnerability and authenticity, which is essential for healing from the wounds inflicted by toxic interactions. When you have people who listen without judgment, celebrate your successes, and hold space for your struggles, you build a support network that strengthens your emotional foundation. But cultivating these relationships requires intentionality. It means learning to discern who truly supports your growth and who might still harbor toxicity beneath a friendly exterior. This discernment deepens your emotional intelligence and helps you invest your time and energy wisely. It's better to have a few quality connections than many superficial ones. Self-care and positive relationships also intersect with the boundaries you've set. Healthy connections respect your limits and encourage your autonomy. They don't demand that you sacrifice your well-being for their comfort. This mutual respect creates a virtuous cycle. Strong boundaries protect your peace, which allows you to engage authentically, which in turn nurtures healthier relationships. Moreover, this step invites you to embrace practices that nourish your mind, body, and soul beyond just social connections. Engaging in creative pursuits, learning new skills, spending time in nature, or simply being present with yourself are acts of self-affirmation. These activities build a rich internal world that toxicity cannot penetrate. When you cultivate your own joy and purpose, you become less dependent on external validation, making toxic people's attempts to unsettle you less effective. This holistic approach to self-care and connection transforms your life from a reactive existence, merely surviving toxic interactions, to a proactive journey of thriving. It's a reclamation of your narrative where you become the architect of your emotional environment rather than a passive inhabitant. Consider this: every moment you invest in yourself and your positive relationships strengthens the foundation of a life impervious to toxicity. This investment pays dividends in increased happiness, resilience, and a deep sense of fulfillment. As you reflect on your journey away from toxicity, ask yourself, how am I nurturing my well-being daily? Who are the people that truly support me? What practices bring me joy and peace? And importantly, how can I prioritize these consistently? Remember, building a life free from toxicity is not just about saying no to harmful influences. It's about saying yes, yes to yourself, yes to growth, yes to meaningful connection. This is the ultimate act of self-love and liberation. When you center your life around self-care and positive relationships, toxic people lose their power not because you resist them, but because you no longer need their validation or approval to feel whole. You create a life so vibrant and strong that toxicity simply cannot exist within it.